Hello everybody, it's TannerFishies here, back again with a new Ninjago video here on the channel. In today's video, we are going to be discussing Kalmaar's demise during Ninjago Seabound, and whether or not it's possible for him to return. And I know that statement does kind of seem a little contradictory, but just hear me out, it'll make sense when we get more into the video. Ninjago villains can basically be classified into a few distinct categories, those of course being those villains that are just written out of the series, the villains that die, or the villains that redeem themselves and just become good guys or lesser bad guys. In the case of Kalmaar, he belongs in the death category. Kalmaar was ultimately killed during Seabound, presumably when he was eaten by Wajira. After failing to control the giant serpent, Wajira basically got fed up with Kalmaar and decided to get rid of him by eating him, and Wajira was ultimately blown up later once Nia destroyed the wave amulet, causing the storm amulet to overload Wajira, and the entire serpent just blew up, and presumably Kalmaar was destroyed during that. If Kalmaar wasn't killed by Wajira eating him, he was probably most definitely exploded during that whole sequence there. Obviously with Kalmaar though, a lot of people really enjoyed him. I personally enjoyed Kalmaar as well. I thought he was one of the best recent villains of Ninjago. Not a fantastic villain or anything when you compare him to some older entries in the Ninjago villains lineup, but in terms of recent Ninjago seasons, Kalmaar's up there. He's basically on par with the Skull Sorcerer and a lot better than characters like Chief Mamadis or Unagami ever were as villains. But in terms of Kalmaar himself, is it possible for him to come back, especially after everything that happened? He basically got double whammied during the finale of Seabound. Is it possible for him to come back? I personally think so. In order to talk about Kalmaar's revival and inevitable return, we need to talk about a villain that kind of went through a similar death to Kalmaar, that of course being Pythor. And again, I'm using the word death very loosely here. In terms of Pythor, a lot of the same things that happened to Pythor happened to Kalmaar as well. Both were eaten by a giant serpent, and the serpent was ultimately destroyed, but in Pythor's case, he came back. Granted, he had bleached skin, so it's not like he went away, completely untouched from that encounter with the Great Devourer, but still, he survived it at least. He survived being swallowed by the Devourer, and he survived the impact of the Devourer exploding during the finale of the first Ninjago season. Obviously, a very similar event went down with Kalmaar. In fact, they are almost identical. Both characters were eaten by a giant snake after trying to control it, and both of them ultimately witnessed the snake blowing up. My point is, if Pythor survived something like this, I think it's safe to say that Kalmaar could have also survived. Excuse me while I showcase some very poorly photoshopped images of white Kalmaar with bleached skin, very similar to how Pythor came back. I think white Kalmaar looks pretty cool, if we're being honest. I think that's actually a really nice design. I'm not the best at photoshopping, but you get the idea. But were the circumstances any different? On the surface, like I said, they were basically the same. Both villains got eaten by a giant snake after failing to control it, but in terms of how the serpent was destroyed, yes, there is a very clear difference here. And this is where I start to get into the reasonings as to why Kalmaar might not have survived this encounter with the ninja, and he might not have survived the ultimate impact of Wajira exploding into nothingness. Like I said, the circumstances between Pythor being eaten by the Great Devourer and Kalmaar being eaten by Wajira, they are very similar. Both got way too confident and both got eaten, and the snakes were destroyed by mystical artifacts. The Great Devourer was of course destroyed by the golden weapons after Garmadon managed to hit the weak spot on the Devourer's forehead, and Wajira was destroyed by the storm amulet overloading, like we said earlier. Nia destroyed the wave amulet, and that caused Wajira's balance to basically become off, and she was ultimately blown up by the overwhelming effect of the storm amulet. Now, the difference is here, when the Devourer exploded, he exploded into a lot of green slime. Wajira just kind of vaporized. She just kind of vaporized into nothing. There was no, leftover stuff like there was with the Devourer. There were no large piles of green slime with Wajira. Wajira just kind of exploded into nothing, which of course does make sense. Wajira is a being that is comprised of the weather, essentially. She exists within the elements of wind and water. Wind and water are not solid, elements, if you want to go ahead and say that. So it would ultimately make sense for Wajira to just explode into the air because, of course, the elemental properties of both wind and water are not solid. You get what I'm saying here. The Devourer might not have been an elemental being, but it was still an organic being. The Devourer was a giant snake at heart. It's an actual animal. It would make sense that when it exploded, there would be things left behind. Now, Pythor managed to escape the Devourer, exploding because, like I said, it exploded into solid material. Pythor would have just been displaced at some point in Ninjago City. He could have easily escaped and went undercover, only for him to return later on in Season 3, revealed to be helping the Overlord. In the case of Wajira, she basically vaporized, so that would essentially mean that Kalmaar would have vaporized as well, not really leaving any room for him to, escape and try to flee into Ninjago City somewhere. Nah, there really wasn't anything like that going on there. So in terms of that context, yes, Kalmar most likely would have not survived the overall final battle of Seabound. While I do think it is possible, though, the circumstances between the Devourer exploding and Wajira exploding are two very different things, like I said. The Devourer exploded into solid material, and Wajira just kind of vaporized into nothing, so there's not really a lot of room, like I said, for Kalmar to escape. And I think it just kind of depends what you want to think. I think it's certainly possible for Kalmar to still be alive. He could have vaporized, obviously, and he most likely did, but let's be real here. Crazier things have happened in Ninjago before. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Ninjago is not a realistic show. It doesn't contain realistic properties, so Kalmar could easily return at some point. I doubt he would have the bleached white skin that you can see in some of these poorly photoshopped images that I developed, but still, I think that is a cool design. Regardless though, Kalmar could still be out there. And imagine this for a second. After his defeat in Seabound, Kalmar would probably be a little crazier. Ultimately with Kalmar, he's one of those villains that just gets crazier and crazier as he goes on, very similar to past Ninjago villains like Master Chen or even Pythor, and with a character with the properties such as Kalmar, I think it's very clear that he could come back very delusional and insane. Very similar to some other Ninjago villains, but he ultimately could become one of Ninjago's most dangerous villains when you break it down. Kalmar's return, I think, would work very well in a season down the line. I don't think he should return in the 2022 seasons, that might be a little too soon, but I totally think the series could bring him back at some point. Kalmar had a lot of potential. His storyline in Seabound was very solid, very good, a little rough around the edges, but still very great nonetheless. He was still a very iconic villain for that season, but I feel like his storyline isn't done just yet. There's still so much that he can do, and I feel like there's room to totally bring him back at some point. Now with Kalmar, like I said, he does kind of fall into the category of villains that are kind of missing or not confirmed to be deceased. I know various sources online list Kalmar as being deceased, but you know, honestly, Ninjago could bring him back if they really wanted to. Kalmar could easily return, but like I said, you do have a long waiting list of other villains that need to come back at some point, and Kalmar is just kind of being added to that one. It does kind of make for a very frustrating scenario that we don't have a confirmation of Kalmar's demise in the show at least, but I imagine that Kalmar could very well come back and finish his storyline at some point down the line. In terms of the context in which Kalmar could return, I honestly think it could work out if he would return to assist the Vengestone buyer. We know that Ninjago is kind of leading towards that arc being concluded, or at least wrapping up in some way or continuing, so having Kalmar be a part of that experience might not be the worst thing ever. I could see it happening in a very similar regard to Pythor's involvement during season 3. You had this overwhelming villain kind of taking control and being the central antagonist, but then you had Pythor there just by his side kind of assisting in any way that he can, and I feel like Kalmar could very well go down the same path. Imagine the Vengestone buyer, whoever he or she may be, comes across Kalmar weakened in Ninjago City after the destruction of Wajira and kind of takes him under his or her wing, maybe raises him up a little bit, fixes him up, and then maybe Kalmar could try to be that treacherous type of character who is kind of the second in command technically, but always is desiring to be the leader, to be the overwhelming threat, to be the main villain. I could totally see Kalmar, I guess, interacting with the Vengestone buyer in that regard, but for the most part, I would very much love to see Kalmar come back and be a central villain on his own at some point in time. Not every returning villain needs to be kind of the sidekick to the new bad guy. They could very well come back and hold a storyline on their own as being the main antagonist. Have Kalmar return seeking revenge on the ninja for destroying him and failing his Wajira plot, and maybe we could see a crazier, more violent Kalmar return in Ninjago's future. Or you could just not bring him back at all. If I had to make a judgment call though, do I think Kalmar could return? Why or why not? I would very much like him to return, but I don't think it's gonna happen. I think Kalmar is just kind of gone for the time being. I've given a reason in this video as to why he could come back and why he probably will not come back, and if I had to realistically think about it, I don't think Kalmar would come back. There was just too much going on within the span of Wajira's defeat that I doubt that Kalmar coming back would even make much sense to the canon. I did say that Ninjago is kind of unrealistic in that regard, and Kalmar could very well come back in the future, but do I think he'll come back? Probably not. It worked for Pythor, of course, Pythor's return, but we already went into why that worked and why Kalmar's return probably would not work out the same way, so if I had to make a solid prediction, no, Kalmar will probably not be coming back at some point, though I would very much welcome it. Now we get into the part of the video where I kind of turn it over to you guys down below in the comments. Feel free to use the comment section to your advantage, talk about whether or not you think Kalmar will return, and if Kalmar were to return, what storyline would you like to see the series explore for him? What would you like Kalmar's role to be in a future Ninjago story, if he were to return, of course? Leave your thoughts down below in the comments, you guys, and that'll pretty much wrap it up for this video here today. Just wanted to give my quick thoughts on whether or not Kalmar could indeed come back, and like I said, I kind of gave an argument as to why he could come back and why he most likely won't, though I would very much much like him too. Leave all your thoughts down below in the comments, guys. That'll pretty much wrap it up for this video here today. Thank you so much for checking out this video. If you enjoyed, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and check out the links down below in the description from other forms of social media. As always, big shout out goes out to my Patreon supporters, including once again the marvelous Jan. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video once again. My name is TannerFishies, and with that I bid you farewell.